Hello, in this grammar lecture, we're going to be talking about how we can use commas and semicolons properly, specifically so that we can clarify ideas. Commas and semicolons are some of the most important types of punctuation, second only to the period, which of course is necessary for every type of sentence. So, in terms of why it's important to use commas and semicolons properly, they really help to improve the overall clarity of your writing, primarily because commas and semicolons, to some regard, really work as pauses in the sentence. Pauses that really can help us to emphasize individual points or elements of the sentence, which is really important for readers to understand, especially what we're trying to denote to them, and of course, so that they can see the different details and how they relate for that overall clarity. So in terms of another important use for commas and semicolons is they allow us to get more sentence variety, so our sentence structures don't become too repetitive. So you can really add dynamics and of course increase the difference and flow and the interest in each sentence and how they build to different paragraphs and of course the essay as a whole. Commas and semicolons, in another regard, really help to show an attention to detail and can really improve your credibility as a writer because it really shows that you took the time to make sure you're punctuating everything as clearly as possible, essentially. So in terms of our comma rules, commas tend to be the most confused in terms of people not necessarily knowing if they should use a comma or if they should delete a comma. And of course, that is primarily caused by how many different comma rules there are. Commas, in comparison to all other types of punctuation, have the most variety in terms of usage, which is why it can lead to that confusion. So when we're thinking about commas, we want to think about the commonality in terms of in what situations do we use commas the most, because that can really help us as we're breaking down the different sentence types and identify where we should use a comma or where we should make sure we're not using one unnecessarily. So our first comma rule is we use commas for compound sentences. So we talked about this a little bit in our last grammar lecture, but a compound sentence is when we are combining two independent clauses with a conjunction, and that conjunction would be one of those fanboys, which would be for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So those words really indicate a relationship between the two independent clauses, and the comma in that sentence is really important because it signals before the conjunction that we are going to be presenting another independent clause. So it's a signal for readers that they should really be paying attention to both sides of that sentence for the overall point that they should be taking away. So for instance, we have their example, commas are really important, comma, but they can be confusing since there are so many rules. So if we think about that comma, it is really that signal so that I know after the conjunction but that I should be looking for a subject and a verb so that that is a complete sentence. And of course, as I'm reading it, it also is a pause. So that is one way that we can figure out if we need a comma in that place. Our second most common comma rule that we use is a comma to set off introductory words. So this is really especially common when we're trying to set up the context for the sentence we're presenting. So establishing the essentially situation in which the sentence is true or occurs, or even how we are using that sentence within our paragraph. So we really want to have that comma separating the introductory word or phrase so that readers know where to look for the main subject and verb of the sentence so they know and can identify that as easily as possible. For example, we have the sentence, however, commas can help to avoid misunderstandings. So that comma after however is there for that pause so readers know that they should be focusing on what comes after it. Our third most common comma rule is a comma for listing, and this actually gets pretty complicated because we actually use commas for listing in a number of different situations, and of course depending on the type of list we're using and depending on how many essentially adjectives, subjects, or objects we are listing, you would use more or less commas. For instance, the first case in which we use commas for listing is when we're listing adjectives. So this is when we're listing two or more adjectives, and they're all of those adjectives essentially are working to describe the specific noun. So we want to have the commas to clarify that those adjectives are working and all of them are working to describe that noun. For instance, if we look at our example, we have commas can help you to write a clear, concise sentence. So looking at that sentence, I have the comma after clear. So that means that as a reader is reading it, there is more of a distinct pause so that readers know that you are listing and that both clear and concise are both referring to sentence. What's really notable about this example is when we're listing those two, we do not need to have and when we're listing two adjectives. We use just the comma to list, and that is that signal to readers. However, in the case in which we are listing more than two adjectives, we would have and between the two last adjectives within that list. So that is really to clarify and make that even more clear. In terms of our next rule, in terms of when we use commas for listing, is when we're listing subjects. And that's specifically when we have multiple subjects completing the action of the sentence. So in this case, the list would come early and the list would be commas separating the different nouns that perform the action. So looking at this example, we have commas, semicolons, and periods are the most commonly used types of punctuation. So we have three different nouns within this list. So commas, semicolons, and periods. So I have that comma to separate. So it's really clear that commas are separate from semicolons. And that if we think of this list, we don't necessarily need a comma after semicolons. Typically, that is very similar to when we would list more than two adjectives, we would just have and. However, we can choose to use a comma there, and that is a very specific type of comma, which we'll get to in a second. So our third type of listing comma is listing objects. So this is when you are listing at the end of the sentence, specifically nouns. So looking at this example, we have when punctuating a sentence, you may use commas, semicolons, and periods. So in terms of this, I'm listing those nouns. I want to make it clear that they are different and that you can do either of these things or any of these things. So in terms of that special comma that I was talking about, that is actually what we call the Oxford comma. So while the Oxford comma isn't necessary for listing, it can serve a lot of purpose, especially in clarifying between different comma rules. So an Oxford comma, that would be when we are using a comma between the two ending nouns or adjectives in that list. So in that case, we would have a comma after the second item in the list before we have the period. And that is really to clarify that we're having three different items that are being listed specifically. So in the case of our examples above, that's when we would have the commas in the subject's example. Commas, semicolons, and periods, we would have a comma after semicolon. And then if we look at the listing objects example, we would again have the commas after semicolon. This is really important, especially as we get into our next comma rule, because it can avoid confusion. So our next comma rule, which is really important to consider, especially when we are listing in a sentence as well, is the rule in which we set off non-essential elements with a comma or comma brackets. So this means that essentially we're presenting additional information somewhere in that sentence. So that additional information can be adding information to clarify the subject or to add commentary. It could be to really clarify a situation. There are really a lot of different options for what's unnecessary. The biggest thing that you would consider when you're judging whether or not the information is unnecessary is, if you take it out of the sentence, will that sentence still be complete? Will that sentence still make sense? So if the answer is yes, then that is the indication that that is unnecessary information, so non essential, so that we need to differentiate it from the root of the sentence. So if we look at our first example, there are many different ways to use commas, a type of punctuation. So the comma here is after the word comma, and it's indicating that the phrase that comes after, which is a type of punctuation, is additional information that is referring to commas. So it's describing what commas are. So if we were to take that out of the sentence would read, there are many different ways to use commas. And that sentence would still make sense. And so that is that indication that we do need that comma there. So another example would be in the case in which the additional information comes in the middle of the sentence. Because, of course, with non-essential elements, we typically see them in the middle of the sentence or the end of the sentence. So in the case of the non-essential information being in the middle, that's when we would have comma brackets. So if we look at this sentence example, we have commas, a type of punctuation, have a lot of different rules to follow. So I have commas after commas and then after punctuation to clarify for readers as they're reading it that after the subject commas, that information is non-essential, and then once they see that comma again, that the rest of the sentence is essential. So it really is bracketing it so that readers can follow along a little bit easier. So our next example for non-essential elements using comma brackets is the sentence, sentences may require punctuation, commas, and semicolons. So if we think about this comma in this situation, that comma is indicating that commas and semicolons is additional information to really illustrate what types of punctuation may be required. So if we think about readers, then these are just presenting examples. However, if we think about our previous comma rules for listing, this may become confusing. So a reader might think that you're listing punctuation, commas, and semicolons. So having 3 elements of a list instead of having commas and semicolons be additional information about punctuation. So this is when the Oxford comma would come in handy when you are listing versus if you are using additional information. So in that case of the Oxford comma, we would have the Oxford comma before the and after the word commas to really clarify that this is a list of 3 versus just 1 with additional information. Our next comma rule is to set off parenthetical information. So parenthetical information is whenever you're presenting information in the middle of a sentence that breaks up the flow of the sentence. So this is a little different because it's not unnecessary information for the sentence. So it's not clarifying or giving more information about any of the nouns or the subject of the sentence. It's parenthetical, meaning that you're adding commentary. So in this case, adding an introductory phrase or a prepositional phrase, instead of having it in the beginning of the sentence, we've moved it to the middle of the sentence. So in order to indicate that to our readers, we would use comma brackets around it. So for example, we have the sentence, when using commas, in my opinion, it is important to consider the purpose of each comma for the sentence. So the parenthetical information is in my opinion. So it changes how a reader would view this sentence. So it's viewing it as more biased and not necessarily a factual statement. So that parenthetical, we want to differentiate it to make it really clear. Our next comma rule is to set off transitional expressions. So this is what we would call conjunctive adverbs. So that would be words like nevertheless, however, therefore. So typically, in most cases, these work as introductory words. However, they become transitional expressions when they are in the middle of a sentence. So for our example, we have commas, however, can serve numerous purposes So you need to be strategic. So that however is that transitional word, I could move it to the beginning of the sentence and the sentence would make sense. But being able to use it in the middle of the sentence can really give us more sentence variety. So we're not starting too many sentences with the conjunctive adverb, however. And our next comma rule is to set off direct quotations. So this is when you are presenting a quote directly from a person. So in this case, for a direct quotation, it requires you to have a verb that a speaker is using before we have the sentence that you're presenting from them. So looking at this example, my mom said, I don't understand when to use commas. So I have that comma after said, so after the verb, which is describing what my mom did, to really indicate that the rest is a direct quote that I'm not paraphrasing, and then I'm taking her direct words. So it's really important to indicate to readers where a quote begins, especially. However, it's important to note that depending on how you're integrating a quote, if you are not beginning that quote integration with a verb, you may not need a comma. It really depends on how it's being integrated. Our next comma rule is a pretty general one because there's a lot that really goes into it. And that would be when we're setting off direct addresses, answers, interjections, or tag questions off from the main part of the sentence. So this is primarily to differentiate the different elements so readers can understand the differences in terms of where the main root of the sentences begin. So that first from a direct address. So that typically a direct address would be when you are talking to someone. So when you are writing dialogue or if you are writing a letter to somebody, you may use their name directly to reinforce that you are talking directly to them. So in writing, we would separate it from the rest of the sentence. So in that example, I replied, you need to use commas, mom. So I really want to make sure that it's clear that this is direct address and that I'm not just presenting a noun within that sentence. So that is why that comma is really important. So in a very similar way, we have commas for direct answers. So whenever you're using a word like yes, no, maybe, that is answering a question, even if it is an implied question. So we would want to have that answer separate from the root of the sentence. So we would have yes, comma, commas can be confusing. Just so it's very clear that yes is not the subject of the sentence, that the subject of the sentence comes after. So a direct interjection is when we're adding more commentary or if we're adding essentially phrases that we tend to say colloquially, meaning in conversation. So these phrases, these interjections tend to add emphasis, like when we're saying oh or oh my god or well or huh. Those are direct interjections. So for example, we have well, I'm getting bored using sentences about commas for all of my examples. So the well is my interjection where I'm giving my feelings, my commentary, and then I just want to make sure I'm separating it from the main subject of the sentence, which is the first person pronoun I, and then the root of the sentence being the action, which is getting bored. And then last for this rule is a tag question. So a tag question is when you are essentially adding a question at the end of a sentence. So essentially you are calling into question or you're asking your audience about something related to that question or to that statement more accurately. So for instance, we would add it to a sentence like this example, making all of my sentences focus on commas is getting old, right? So if we think about it, making all of my sentences focus on commas is getting old, that is a statement I'm making. So that could be its own sentence, but I'm adding a tag question because I am telling or signaling specifically to the reader that I am asking them this question about that statement that I've made. And usually the tag questions are to check the idea or reinforce the idea that I presented in that sentence. And last of our comma rules, and the probably most basic of the comma rules, would be when we use commas to separate parts of an address, place names, and dates. These are really just to clarify the different parts, especially for readers who may not be familiar with the places you're talking about, or in terms of dates, to make sure that you're clearly separating and you're not adding or changing the year so people know specifically when you're referring to. So for address, we would have San Diego City College is located at 1313 Park Boulevard, San Diego, California. So I have the comma after Boulevard and after Diego just to indicate that these are the different items in that address. And then with place names, that is very similar. So we don't experience different seasons living in San Diego, California. So we do want to have that comma between San Diego and California, primarily because we can't assume that every audience is going to know what state the city is in. And of course, this gets even more important when we get into the names of cities that also might be the names of other places like other states or even other countries. And then, of course, last, we have our example dates. Today is August 1st, 2020. So we have that comma separating the one from the year. And that is just to emphasize and, of course, clarify so readers don't become confused by those numbers. And finally, we get to semicolon rules, which after talking about so many comma rules, it's actually a bit of a relief because there actually are only 2 semicolon rules. And that is because semicolons serve a specific function. They, in terms of if we look at the image of the semicolon, that really is an indicator of when we could use it. So if we think of the image of the semicolon, which we have on the screen, the base of it is a comma. However, there is a period on top of it. So if we think about that in terms of a meaning, the period and the comma being combined to create a semicolon is telling us a lot about how we use semicolons. So if we think about the comma is showing relationship. So it's showing a connection, so we're able to combine things. However, the period is showing the end of idea. Similar to when we end a sentence, we end it with a period to indicate that we are done presenting whatever point we were making. So when we use a semicolon, we are using it to indicate that relationship to whatever it is we are combining, as well as the end of ideas so that readers know that the next part there's going to be presenting a different idea. So this is really traditional in terms of the first semicolon rule, which is a compound sentence, which we've talked about in our last grammar lecture. So when we're using a semicolon to combine a compound sentence, we are combining 2 independent clauses with the semicolon instead of a conjunction. So we would not use a conjunction at all. So we would not have any of the fanboys, which of course would be for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So we would delete those and use the semicolon instead of the comma. And this is another way of showing that relationship and giving us variety. So we're not using the fanboys over and over again when we're using compound sentences. So if we think about like the usage, the importance of when we can combine 2 independent clauses with the semicolon is they do have to be related or they need to be relevant together in some way. However, the semicolon is a little bit more vague because it's not indicating the specific type of relationship that we are choosing to combine the sentences with. So we have our example. So today is Wednesday. The vice presidential debate is on tonight. So looking at that sentence, we have a subject being today, a verb being is, and the completer. And then after the semicolon, we have the subject being debate, and then we have the verb being is. So I still would check both sides of this sentence to make sure that I have 2 independent clauses so that I can use a semicolon in this case. And our last rule for semicolons is we use semicolons for listing, especially when there are other comma rules used. So we use it for listing to clarify. And of course, this can really help. It's very similar to the Oxford comma when we have additional information within that sentence, but we have a list at the same time. So in this case, we use the semicolon to clarify what essentially the additional information is referring to, and then between the different elements of that list. So we have our example. There are a lot of different elected government positions, like state representatives who serve in Congress, senators who serve in the Senate, and the president who runs the executive branch. So I have this semicolon after Congress and after Senate because those phrases, the who serves or who runs, that is indicating that additional information. So by separating the list in those two places, I'm making it very clear what the additional information is referring to. And that can go a long way, especially the more complicated that list, or if you are informing an audience about something that they are not as familiar with, then the semicolon for listing with additional information comes in a lot of hand in terms of adding that clarity. And in terms of getting into revision strategies, because of course there are a lot of punctuation rules, and it does take some practice into terms of like figuring out which ones to use where and to make sure we're not using excessive amounts of commas or semicolons, is we can go through this process. So if we're thinking of checking where we're missing semicolons and pauses, the easiest way that we can check that is by reading your essay aloud, or even having your computer read it aloud for you. Most computers have a built-in shortcut which will read a text aloud. So when you read the text aloud, when you hear a pause, either a pause in which you are trying to emphasize something, or a pause you take as you're reading it, or even if you're having a computer read it aloud and there's a pause, or if the computer is reading it aloud and it's too long, then that is an indication that there is a comma or a semicolon that should be in that place. So when that happens, then we would consider, okay, what purpose would this comma serve, and then decide whether or not to include it there. So that is the easiest way to kind of start to judge. And then of course, the more you read, the more you become familiar and consider how other people are using commas and where they're using them, the easier that can help you in terms of figuring out and clarifying the comma rules for yourself.